Hi, I'm David Jackson. I'm a local historian in Kansas City, so I'm here to introduce to you Pitcher Cemetery. As you can see here, Pitcher Cemetery has a nice entrance. Fares a little bit better than most pioneer cemeteries, which don't have fences or entryways or signs for that matter. Pitcher Cemetery is probably one of about 400 pioneer cemeteries in Jackson County, Missouri. And most of our pioneer cemeteries were developed on land by the pioneers, starting with one family, maybe two families, and some of them growing into whole communities, which is like Pitcher Cemetery. Pitcher Cemetery started on Thomas Pitcher's land. Thomas was a colonel in what's become known as the Mormon War in the 1830s. And some of the earliest burials here are Mormon-related burials. Pitcher Cemetery contains roughly 180 graves, although you wouldn't know it by looking at it, surveying the land, because most people who were buried here were buried either without a tombstone, or the tombstone that they had has not survived. Fortunately for us, we have a few samples, including this one here on the ground that I'm standing next to, for George Hinkle. And I wanted to point out how long this tombstone is. So it would have been dug into the ground about halfway, and then would have stood up about 3 feet from the ground. And that's how most of these tablet forms of tombstones were erected originally. The oldest burial that we have documented in Pitcher Cemetery is for Leadstone Nolan, a Revolutionary War patriot. Jackson County has about 20 Revolutionary soldiers that made it this far west, and Leadstone's one of them. He died in 1839. So that's the earliest number that we have associated with Pitcher Cemetery. And Leadstone was Thomas Pitcher's grandfather. So he was either clearly buried either on his own property or on his grandson's property, Thomas Pitcher. The Daughters of the American Revolution, of course, marked this grave in the 1920s, and subsequent markings have been added to document Leadstone's life here in Jackson County. The Nolan name is famous in Jackson County for the road, Nolan Road, and there are descendants still living today that know quite a lot about that famous pioneer family. We're at the back of Pitcher Cemetery. This is the northwest corner of the cemetery, and in 1864, during the Civil War, the Battle of Westport that raged right through this area, lots of casualties were buried right here in a mass Civil War grave. And that is kind of common in many cemeteries throughout Jackson County, which had several skirmishes and battles in the 5 years that the war was fought. Lots of mass graves and paupers also. People who couldn't afford to have their grave dug were buried in pauper graves in many cemeteries, including municipal cemeteries today. Another mass grave here at Pitcher includes some burials of people that we know who died in the 1840s during the cholera epidemic. And we don't know who they were. There are no records from those early days, but we do know that there is another mass burial here, and then tradition that's been carried forward since the 1830s that documents that fact. This is a memorial marker for Kathleen Toohey. She's not buried here in Pitcher Cemetery, but Kathy, as most people knew her, was a local historian like myself, who in 1989 rediscovered Pitcher Cemetery in the woods, and she, as I said before, helped to muster the whole community around restoring the cemetery. They had to cut lots of brush, lots of trees, and she spent 21 years spearheading the project to keep Pitcher Cemetery alive and well. Kathy spent many years, of course, working on the cemetery, but she was also a friend of mine and a co-worker at the National Frontier Trails Museum, where she started transcribing trail diaries in the early 1990s. I was also a great friend of hers, and she taught me how to dowse or witch for graves right here in Pitcher Cemetery. So we thought we would take a moment just to show you how divining or witching works. For anybody who's not dowsed or witched for graves, look it up on the internet. It's kind of a mysterious function that I cannot explain, other than the fact that if you take either two metal rods like I fashioned here, you can make them out of coat hangers, metal coat hangers. My grandfather made these out of welding rods. There's another way too, using willow branches. And when you walk over a grave with either these sticks or with those twigs, these rods will crisscross. I'm doing that purposefully here just to show you. And then when you step off of a grave, they uncross. And the only thing I can explain is that it's disturbed ground. There's some magnetic property that is different in disturbed ground and undisturbed ground. My archaeological friends do not care about or even like to talk about divining or witching. They would prefer to come out and do their digs. There are also modern inventions called ground penetrating radar, where electronic machines can be brought out and they roll it over the ground and it actually identifies where burial pits are. I'm gonna just illustrate what happens when you step over a grave and the rods crisscross like this. And you walk really slow, and I'm stepping off of a grave, you can actually feel it, and they uncross. I'm not doing that, they're happening on their own. If I take another couple of steps, you can see there's another burial that I'm walking on top of right now. And in another step, I'm off of it. And so if I had somebody here following me with surveying stakes, for instance, and plotting each of the corners that I identify, eventually we can look back and you can see the entire row of graves or burials, seeing those flags. Thank you for visiting with us today, but I encourage you, no matter where you lived, to get out into your community and visit a pioneer cemetery like Pitcher Cemetery and discover the uniqueness that is above the ground, and think about all the history, all the lives of the people who are buried there in that parcel of land. And if you go the next step to volunteer, to help maintain, or to even restore a local cemetery in your community, more power to you, and we thank you for doing that. We've got some resources at the end of this video that can guide you to how to restore a cemetery, how to maintain it, with a booklet that we make available. There's also, for those interested in Jackson County history, a reprint of a book called Vital Historical Records that is a reprint of the 1933 Daughters of the American Revolution volume that identified all of the cemeteries throughout Jackson County. And just imagine the DAR ladies in the 1930s traipsing through old cemeteries like this in the day before air conditioning, and when women had to wear dresses from their neck to their toe, and transcribing tombstones at all of these cemeteries. Those resources are available to you at the end of the video, and we hope you enjoy. Thank you.